And there perhaps is a need for a coherent assessment development framework. And I'd like to focus on a framework which is driven by the features of the language and driven by the particularities of the setting. And I'll try and explain what I mean by these two. So in this presentation, I'll start off by giving a sort of very quick overview on what's going on. My work focuses mainly on the global south, so I will review what's going on in the global south, so low and middle income countries. I will focus on researcher-developed work, which is really university-led, and then also adapted work, which sometimes is university-led and sometimes it's also by independent assessors. And then I look at common assessment frameworks, which has a very tight grip on low and middle income countries, because these are frameworks that are developed elsewhere and then brought into these countries. I will then go into what we have tried to do in our project, mainly trying to get a sense of how do you define rigor and test construction. It's been a squiggly path, and I'll take you through that a bit, and then where to go from here. So to start off with what's going on, we've been running a review of high quality work coming out of low and middle income countries. It's a 30-year review. I'm going to present data from the first 3 waves, which was about 20 years of the review work. So if you take vocabulary assessments, these are all from studies that have been judged to be of high quality in terms of rigor of research. We are now looking at the measures they've used. The studies come from quite a few countries, around 25, and there are 63 tests in this mix. Most of them tend to be a replication of the Peabody picture vocabulary task, which has a good framework. It has 4 items. There's a target item, and if you're good with your distractors, you're not doing a bad job in trying to capture, as long as you're not taking items and simply translating them language to language. That's when the problem begins. So localization is an issue, and it's underreported in the literature. There are very good alternatives that have emerged over the last 30 years. For example, this particular one, which those of you who are in speech and language will recognize as a semantic fluency task, which is name as many as you can of a certain category name. There are others who've tried, this is in Tanzania, who basically looked at, here is a word, I'm going to tell you another 4 words. Can you tell me what's related to this word? So if you have the word chick, and in your list you have hen, you should be able to pick up that that's semantically related. And then there are the ones that are, this is really with Bahasa Indonesia, and it's a agglutinative language, multimorphemic, and the attempt here is similar to morphological manipulation. So if you drop something or change something, what's the outcome? Now, these innovations are rare, and we don't get these coming up to a point of being then picked up by other languages. But that's not typical just to the language assessment sector. We see that also in literacy assessment, and if you just take symbol knowledge, which is really letter knowledge, it's the simplest aspect of assessing emergent literacy into early literacy. Most of the studies internationally are looking at letter sound, letter name. Many of the languages, however, have the same letter sound, letter name, so their name and sound don't differ. So it's unusual for a language to then try and get a letter name, letter sound kind of equivalent test. There are some innovations here. For example, good innovations coming out of Arabic. This is a particular test from Egypt, and they're looking at your target letter, and then you give visually confusable pairs, and you try and get to the letter you want. And then there's the kind of work that's happening from what I call extensive orthographies. That means orthographies where you're not going to learn your whole symbol set within the first year. So it doesn't make sense to be thinking of symbol learning as completed within the first year. You need to think of it more in terms of the whole variety of symbols available. So innovations are present, but not enough. More recently, I've been looking at tasks that are becoming common across these countries, and this is a data set shared with me by UNESCO. These are 34 data sets shared by the governments. We are looking at 8 language families, 31 languages. And I'm going to pick up one country and look at their languages and what's going on in terms of assessment. And now I'm talking of assessment at scale. So these are not the researcher-driven small-scale assessments. These are not the clinical assessments. These are assessments that are now making an impact on education in these countries. So because these assessments need to be comparable across states in these countries and then across countries, they usually adopt a common framework of assessment. I'm interested in both literacy and language, but I'll focus much more on language. But I'd like to show you what's being assessed in language in comparison to literacy, because you will see very quickly that language doesn't really get assessed. It's literacy that gets assessed. Although we do know if you don't have your language foundations in place, literacy is really going to get stuck at some. You'll plateau off when you come to reading comprehension. So this is taken from India. What's inside the orange box, that's the language section. And the rest of it is all around literacy. We have multiple language families. Most of these are the languages in India that were assessed. And you will see that there's much more in terms of symbol knowledge and decoding. Vocabulary, the problem with this vocabulary test was that it was translated items across the different languages. Listening comprehension tending to be about direct questions on very short passages. So not a lot of innovation there. We don't, but high psychometric properties, but not enough in terms of comprehensively getting to the language of the child. I'd like to take the example of Arabic. So here we have the data set from 2 Arabic regions, but the regions were not shared. So I don't know where this Arabic data is coming from. And Arabic has diglossia. And at this level, you really need to know where you're working. Are you in Morocco? Are you sitting in Jordan? It's unclear. So that's another issue about trying to look at tests. If you don't know where it's coming from, how do you decide if it's psycholinguistically embedded? And then I'd like to look at languages from Africa, the Bantu language family. Again, as you can see, much more happening with literacy, much less happening with language. So this is a global scenario of what's going on with language assessment at scale. There's not enough information to go to scale. And when it is university-led or small scale, it is much more of the same. We're not seeing enough innovation coming up. So then let's move to sentence level. And here I'm continuing the Bantu language family as an example. The gloss there is the sentences I'd like you to focus on. There was a stranger who was very hungry. He came to a village and asked for food. Nobody had any food. And that in the 3 languages, these are 3 languages from South Africa. And below, let's just focus on sentence 1. And you can see that in Northern Sotho, there are 13 words in that sentence. And then as you get morphologically rich and agglutinating, the number of words reduce, but all the information is bundled into words. And by the time you come to isiZulu, which is the 3rd language there, you will see that sentence 1 has 3 words. Now, this has huge implications on what you're going to do with assessment. It has implications for your morphosyntax assessment, really in terms of something like sentence repetition, which is a task I really like. But it has implications on what you're going to challenge the child with. And it definitely has implications for something like reading fluency assessment, which is a very, very popular test globally. Because what do you say in terms of words per minute? Because this is something else that's going on here. So there's a morphological density that's being ignored when you do a word count. So that's what's going on. But let's now turn to what we have tried. I want to say that our attempt at getting into oral language assessment has been particularly interesting because we started in the middle of the COVID lockdown, which was a boon because we did things we might not have done otherwise. And I will show you what we did. But I will talk mainly from this particular project, the Talk Together project. The Talk Together project is a multi-site project mainly focused on Philippines and India. These are countries we chose because they are intensely multilingual and we wanted to work in these multilingual contexts. We were attempting in the first set of studies to map the linguistic environments the children were in. The second set of studies were language assessments, and the third were interventions. And I'll focus on the assessments. But we really depended a lot on the mapping exercise. So in trying to define robustness of tests, we thought we should focus on 4 separate parameters. One was about construct definition. The second about the context, because context definitely will define how we are going to see these tests performing. The third was meaningfulness. Is there any purpose to a test which doesn't then contribute to change in learning in the classroom? We had to address this very quickly and early in the project. So the usability, the user engagement had to be high enough for it to be an investment that was worthwhile for these governments. And then psychometric properties. I will focus today mainly on the first 2, construct and context, but I will show you how that's impacting psychometric properties when we've actually settled down to look at the properties of these tests. So starting with construct definition, the basic idea is that if we want to assess language, we need to work with what the language characteristics are. It's simply not about translating a format. It's about what is the language informing us, because then we are wanting to assess what the child is learning or not learning. So we need to go with what the demands of the language might be. So given that we are interested in oral language, the idea was, where do we get our data sets to be able to identify good enough items? The general tendency in languages that are under-researched has been to go with textbooks. So you go to the textbook, you collect a set of words, or you collect sentences, and then you play around with it. So the corpus is really small, and it's purpose-driven and curriculum-led in a sense. But it was very clear to us that a lot of these textbooks are artificially graded so that it's decodable text, it's easier, it is very tight topic areas. So that's really not the language we wanted to evaluate. So we moved away from that and we started looking at child-directed print. So we were interested in corpus data, but we wanted it to be from children's storybooks. And that's what we then started working on. I'd like to present what was our motivation and then what did we settle on. So our motivation was that we will work with child-directed print, but we also were very clear that we will not have all the computational infrastructure to be able to do automatized parsing, tagging. None of that is available in the languages we work in. So our basic research question was, can we have a smaller corpus, and can that corpus do the job for us? So we then settled on what's called the non-seq. The NSP stands for non-sequential sampling protocol, and really it's a small corpus development protocol. And that's taking every randomly selected sentences from every book. So what we then focused on was books for children from age 3 to 10, and criteria for selecting of sentences, which were all random, and a lot of focus on what books went into our corpus. Now, child publishing in many of the contexts we are interested in are translated books, often by one translator. So you're really limiting the semantic field of these books So we had to make very clear decisions that the number of books per translator couldn't be more than X. We could have overrepresentation of award-winning writers. So there were lots of things we had put down as our criteria, fiction, non-fiction, textbook, all of these things. So we had about, in the first few languages that we worked on Filipino and Kannada first, Filipino Tagalog from Philippines and Kannada from South India. So we tried this out with these two languages. And having done that, we were aware that a smaller corpus will never be as good as the bigger corpus. So we were not surprised that it was not capturing as much as the bigger corpus, but we were still interested, is it capturing enough for our purposes? Because it's more about, is it giving us more than what we have now, and is it giving us valid information? So I have over here from one of the corpora, this is from the Kannada one, just word length. And we are looking at the phoneme length of the words, and Akshara is the orthographic unit of Kannada, the Indic writing system. And what you have in the lighter brown is the bigger corpus, the full corpus of about 500 books. And the darker brown is the selective corpus, where we've non-sequentially collected this. And we thought, I mean, of course, statistically, they're not equivalent, but there's enough here for us to be confident that it's going to pick up the word types we are interested in. I want to draw your attention to how long the words are in this language. So if you take a word like supercalifragilistic, you would reach around 20, I think. And if you take the word multilingualism, I think you're around 12 or 15. And if you take somebody like Cami, then it's about 4. So that's the word lengths in this language are big, long, and that's because it's multimorphemic, not just multisyllabic. So a lot of stacked affixes. That's the language. Having done our selective corpus, then we settled down to do our manual tagging. And this is where we've looked at by parts of speech and also by book levels. And here, book levels are not the levels provided by the publishers, because very quickly we realize these book levels don't work. Because when you're doing translation, you just carry over the book level of the original book. And the translation has changed the textual complexity entirely. So internal to the project, we had our own book leveling tool, which is open access. And then we did our book leveling. And then over here, what you're seeing, the blue lines, which are not visible in all because they're almost isomorphic. The blue lines are from the youngest, the books for the youngest readers, 3 to 5. The orange for 6 to 8, and the 9 to 10-year-olds, that's in green. And that's by the different word parts of speech. We were interested in this mainly because we were aware that vocabulary testing has somehow, at least the picture vocabulary testing, receptive vocabulary testing, has got very noun bound. It's really nouns. Item sets are all about nouns. We were interested to go beyond that. Having looked at some of the psycholinguistic infrastructure that we needed, we also wanted to have some sense about the developmental characteristics of the language acquisition. Again, not available because there's not enough research in the area. So we set ourselves up to work with age of acquisition, and we had to make some basic decisions. The first decision was, do we replicate the kind of age of acquisition study usually out there? Those studies are, again, very noun focused. Those studies are very often monomorphemic. It was clear for us we had to be multimorphemic. So we attempted multimorphemic words and age of acquisition. Our pilots showed us it was really hard for parents and teachers and early language, speech and language therapists to decide on the age of acquisition for multimorphemic words, because were they focusing on the stem or the affix? It wasn't clear what was going on. So we had to do quite a few methodological sort of trials before we settled on the lists, before we collected our data. This is Kannada on the top panel and Filipino on the bottom panel. the first thing I want to draw your attention to, this is for 885 words across all parts of speech, not all, but about 5 parts of speech. Kannada, 72% of the words were multimorphemic when we started off, and then we had to standardize. That was the unconstrained set. And Filipino, it was 52%. After we had set up the list and we had gotten the data, it looked like this was the mean distribution of the age of acquisition as reported by those who are working with children in this age band. The colorful bar graphs there, those bar graphs are about the number of morphemes by the number of phonemes. So a confound in these languages really is, if you are wanting to look at word length, it's going to be multisyllabic and multimorphemic. So if you want to do controlled experiments, you really need to work at how do you control for it. So in this paper, we control the number of phonemes to 9, and then we look at all morpheme levels that's visible within the 9. And then you can see that age of acquisition for for words with more morphemes are a little later. So that you can see only with that very tight control. But what was very clear from our data is that you can have early age of acquisition with high frequency multimorphemic words and later age of acquisition for low frequency monomorphemic words. So it's not by the morphemic length that it goes. We also found that more concrete words were earlier in age of acquisition and the more abstract ones were later. So we've also equipped with this data when we started developing our tests. Now, defining context was another area that we had to work with. We were interested in home language and school language. I'll split this up. My focus will be on home language, but we are beginning to find effects of school language we had not anticipated. And I'd be interested in your response to what we are finding from school language. So this is an example from one of our research sites. You have 20 schools at the bottom. The second row is the language of assessment, Hindi. So that's the second row. And you will, the darker blue it gets, that means more children in that school are speaking the assessment language. And what you see is there are many schools here where children are not speaking the language of assessment, which also happens to be the language of the school instruction. So there are multiple other languages. Having said that, we had willfully chosen the site because it was a site that was at the border of 3 large linguistic states. And we had picked on that site because we wanted to see what's happening in the classroom. So the languages that I was talking about in that particular research site, some are close cousins to the instruction language, the assessment language, some are further apart. So that's the mix that we're looking at in this particular context. So what does that mean? If you want to do sentence repetition, where you just say, listen carefully to what I say and then repeat, and you have your school language, the language of instruction that you're making your items in, what does it mean if there's a home dialect? And what does it mean if there's another home language? So I've taken one sentence, which is we had a good chat with granddad. That's the sentence. And I just want you to look at the words across the 3 lines by the color code. And you will see that the blue color code, it differs, the yellow color code differs, and the gray. But those are meant to capture the same idea, the same part of the thing. So there's word order changes, but there's also change at the level of the word. So this was the kind of sentence that was not performing very well when we came back and looked at the data. So the blue line in the graph there would be the ideal fit. That means you're able to capture by the ability of the children. The higher your ability, the better your score will be, but we were not picking that up. So we went back to the drawing board to see, okay, what's happening with each of those languages? Which part of the sentence is the most vulnerable to change across these language families? So here it is where your cap, and it's not the cap that changes, it's the verb that changes. So you're aware that that's what's going to happen across these sentences. So we went back to item construction and slowly were able to get to a point where we were able to have some kind. These are, I wouldn't say all of these are cognates, but we were able to stay close, at least phonologically close, for many of these sentences. So in the end, after we had done our sort of first round of pilot, second round of pilot, we settled on 10 sentences. And those are the psychometric properties of the test when we completed all the analysis. But actually, having done all of that in one location, when you go back into the field, we have had 3 rounds of data come in, one with about 600 children, another with 700. Each time we went back, there were no new languages in the community. There was inward migration. There were all kinds of things happening. So I think our biggest challenge, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on this, is how do you try and analyze the effects of these multilingual contexts and performance on tests? Are you looking at home language, but these are children who have, that's for the first set of children, the 646, the number of languages in their home, the most had at least 2, if not 3 and 4. So that's not unusual for many of these contexts. So we are trying to understand what is the best way to estimate the home language impacts on the test performance. But moving to school language, which we thought we had controlled by making sure we were taking only schools that had the same language as the language of instruction. But we went to new research sites where the language of instruction varied by the number of hours that language was taught. So in some places, all subjects were taught in the index language, and in other places, it was a specialist subject area. And this was for primary school and including sometimes in the preschool setting. So we decided to look at, okay, if the language of instruction changes, but the target language is being taught in both, would there be any change in the semantic networks that these children have? So we picked on semantic networks to just get a sense of what school languages were doing. And this is a paper in preparation. The idea was that languages are emergent, languages are basically driven by the encounters and experiences the children had. We were using language of instruction as an index of what might be happening. So we returned to one of the first tests I showed you, which was the semantic fluency test, which is name as many X as you can, which is in 45 seconds or a minute. So here's data from a language of instruction A, type A kind of classroom, and you have the network analysis of this particular, the sort of the kinds of words that the children said. The way you code it is, if the words are all semantically linked, you call it a cluster. If they then switch into another category area, then you call it a switch. And then you again look at the next cluster. You identify cluster size. You also look at number of switches. But in a network analysis, what you're looking at is what are the nodes and how far are the words from each other. So that's from the language of instruction classrooms. And this is a good 10 classrooms, I mean, across 10 schools. And that's from another language of instruction classroom. And we are not very sure what's going on here because the schools share a curriculum, but they don't share in pedagogical practices. So there are differences in pedagogical practices. So there are differences in how much of project work is going on, how much of time is given for actual oral language support. But this is an unexpected finding in our project. We are still not clear how this should be factored into our analysis of our tests. But we do think there's something going on here that's under-researched and we need to look at. We've been very focused on home language impacts, but I think there are also school language and instruction type impacts that we need to think about when we look at oral language assessment. So this finding is across domains. So This particular network is for name as many animals as you can, but we've also asked name as many fruits as you can, name as many body parts as you can. So we've done across different semantic categories. So moving to psychometric properties, this is an area that internationally I think we've got very good at doing. So there are very high quality ways in which it's being done. I'll try and show you the psychometric properties of one test, a vocabulary test. I've taken our Hindi work here. And as you might have guessed by now, our items are developed from the corpus. So what you have here are 3 books from the corpus. I think we're running out of time, but I have to tell you the story of at least one of these books. The one with the sleepy donkey is a donkey who just doesn't want to wake up, so goes around looking for help, gets to the cock. The cock says, I wake up the world, I can wake you up. But, the donkey sleeps through it. Finally, the dog tries to help, the cow tries to help. And one day the donkey does wake up. And that's because a mosquito sat on his nose and he sneezed and he woke up. And then the mosquito becomes his friend. So there are stories like this. And this is just wonderful set of books. I'm just trying to communicate that level of narrative expression will not be in a textbook. You really need the storybook to get to that. And then it's a classic 4 pictures. You say the word and the child has to then point to the word, the picture that is about the word. And this is with distractors, that there's a semantically closed distractor, semantically far distractor, and a phonological distractor. We had too many easy words when we came back after, we had about 200 items when we came back after our first round of about 150 children. These were all the very easy words. I'll just take 3 from here. Laugh, pickle, which is achar in many of these languages, and to see. When we reviewed this, many of these words were shared across the languages of the region, and these were really true early vocabularies. There were also words that had very poor alignment. They were, in a sense, sick items. So here's the word bimar or sick, and we had these 4 pictures. These pictures simply didn't work. We had thought that we had semantically close and semantically far, but it just didn't work. Because for a child who's unwell, if you cut your finger, you're sick. If you've got a cold, you're sick. And if you're sick, you sleep in the bed. So it could be any of those. So this was really a poor fitting item, and the graph there shows that to you. Anyway, we managed to get to a point of 50 items, and this is the sort of psychometric properties of what we managed to pick up. And we thought we had a test which had a good item fit. The estimates from personability was excellent in terms of the spread and the alignment of item difficulties. 2 ability estimates were good. So then we took this into the field and we looked at how this was performing in the field. So this is data from 680 children. It seemed to have been able to bear up to the demands in the field. Now, this is where more languages have come into the mix. And so to clarify, this has nouns, adjectives, and verbs. It's overrepresented for nouns, but it has a fair number of verbs and a fair number of adjectives. The grading, the item numbers were the grading. We thought these items had the difficulty level of these items from our first sample set. But as you can see, it gets mixed up as you go into the larger community. No significant differential item functioning by gender. So that's good, because that's a concern when you're doing these early vocabularies. And these are the kind of verbs that we'd used. One is to wash, and the other is to fill. All pictures in this test are from the Creative Commons, from children's books that are in the Creative Commons. So these are all from the Creative Commons. Ideally, we'd like to see differential item functioning by some parameter of language background. We'd love to see it. We are struggling to have a robust way of doing that. And just this morning have settled on, we think it's not a cop-out. what we have decided to do is have multiple estimates and see what are the trends across those estimates. So one estimate would be if the child has mentioned the language of instruction in any of the languages at home, they would be Hindi or the target language. And if not, they've not mentioned the language at home, Hindi as the language at home, there would be no Hindi. So with that kind of analysis, it looks like the differential item functioning is okay. But it's a problematic way of looking at it because the amount of Hindi differs across the home. So you really don't know what's going on. So we think that other way in which we'll carve up the data, the group, the categorization, because I think we are not very clear what's the best categorization is the number of languages at home. So those with 1, those with 2, and those with 3 and more. We hope in the next 4 or 5 months, we'll have a sense of which of these estimates work, but maybe we'll have a sense that you need all the estimates to get the picture. It's not that one will give you the answer. But this is the kind of work we are trying in our research group. So where to from here? Well, my personal interest is what do you do in terms of supporting under-researched languages so that they have the infrastructure to get good quality tests in place, but also excellent experimental work and intervention happening. And I'm interested in multilingual settings. So if we are attempting to get a test construction framework, we think that the two areas that we need to articulate better is how are we going to ensure that the language domain is adequately reviewed before item selection begins. But otherwise, item selection tends to be, as I said earlier, translation and imageability. Often it's can I draw the picture? And so there are sort of non-linguistic ways in which these decisions are being made. So I think there needs to be much more psycholinguistic decision making. And the other is the localization process, which is often cut short. And we need a much stronger localization process. For us as a research group, we want to understand better what's going on with the semantic field when you have different languages of instruction and different pedagogical methods. It's not clear what's going on there. We do think it's a good idea to go beyond nouns. We've been focusing mainly on verbs and adjectives. We'd like to unpack that a little more. We are very pleased that we've moved away from a binary of morphologically simple and morphologically complex the moment you have one affix to the word. So we now work with number of morphemes, but we need to unpack what that means for word representation and processing. I think what we are trying to look at, and more globally, I think what may be useful is for languages to be able to locate themselves between morphologically elaborate and simple along a continuum. And for this, we are recommending a corpus linguistics approach. And I think it's ideal time to try and do this because the world has exploded in terms of open access children's book publishing. So that's going to be the source. I acknowledge that any of this corpus linguistic work will need to go alongside expert judgment, so perhaps some Delphi kind of method for decision making. My interest is also in literacy, so ideally we should be able to look at whether the orthography is simple or complex, and then look at where the language sits. So the expert judgment to drive that core framework development would be both to vet the construct and context definition, and to bring focus on something I have not touched on in this talk, but which I think is central for this kind of investment. What is the meaningfulness of the test, and is it usable? This work would not have been possible without some of the research team. Our members are here, but it's almost 100, 150 research team members who've supported us. That's them. Some of the work comes from the region of the Punjabi Bhangra dance, and that's what you're seeing there, giving you the pose from the Bhangra. And close to 1,000 children for the data set I shared. Thank you.